So today I'm going to be talking about vulnerability debt versus emerging threat, and it actually fits in really well with some of the conversation between Jason and Yaniv earlier, which I'm excited about because some of the metrics they show up. Independent research came to similar conclusions, so that's always a big bonus. So I'm a security researcher. I work at vulnerabilities. I've helped build and grow several different cybersecurity companies you might be familiar with. Duo Security, helped with go-to-market on Census, helped spin up and scale Blue Mira in the SIM space, and then more recently in the vulnerability management space, worked at Nucleus Security, and now the Intel company, exploit intelligence company, vulnerabilities. So thanks for having me. I played a lot of different roles from product all the way to go-to-market and security research. And I'm going to kind of rapid fire with some visuals as I talk in this talk. But specifically, I'm talking about emerging threat versus vulnerability debt. So when I think about practitioners, the idea behind this talk is to shift your mindsets a little bit and thinking about two separate things that Jason and Yana have talked about earlier, which there are things that you need to respond to really quickly and take care of and take time sensitive, and then there's a big pile of vulnerability debt. And I'm going to kind of hop in first with vulnerability debt and break down some of my observations as where some of this is coming from and trends, and why as a practitioner you might be feeling a bit overwhelmed. And then I have some actionable takeaways as we go through this as well. One thing I do want to highlight in the research that I'm showing, I have new research in here that I haven't published. Also, not all of it is completely finished. I was planning on doing it Sunday and I got in a mountain biking accident. So you'll see some more subsequent things published if you follow me on LinkedIn or the vulnerabilities blog as well. Two things to highlight when we're looking at the research. When we're talking about different time periods, we're looking at NVD and CVE-based vulnerabilities. And then also, when I talk about known exploited vulnerabilities, I'm talking about vulnercheck Kev, which is a free resource that we provide. It's inclusive of SysAkev, so I just want to distinguish that. And then some of the other data is using our commercial intelligence feed. But first off, I want to talk about vulnerability debt. And I think this is very reflective of, I think, how a lot of vulnerability management teams are feeling. If we look at just CVE disclosure over the last 10 years, in this study, I looked at CVEs between 2014 and 2023. CVE disclosure grew by about 14.1% annually. So pretty significant growth. This was mainly driven by the CVE numbering authority projects, and that more organizations are issuing CVEs. And for purposes of this exercise, I took over the 10 years, the 161,000 roughly CVEs, and then I colorized on a 10 by 10 chart. So there's 100 different pieces, think of 100%, purple. And we're going to layer in additional, threat-based information in this, just to kind of highlight the severity of the different problems. So next, if we take a step down, something really important for people to look at is known exploited vulnerabilities. We can see that known exploited vulnerabilities, there has been a significant uptick in disclosure of known exploited vulnerabilities. Growth rate even faster than CVEs, about 20% year over year. And if you look at different resources like the DBIR, Mandiant's Intel report as well, I'm feeling great, by the way. Do with it, but the growth rate is faster than CVE growth itself. And so if I layer that in, it ends up being about 1.1% of known vulnerabilities, CVEs during this time period, are known to be exploited, right? So those are going to be things that you certainly want to think of prioritizing, depending on where your asset is and asset context as well. Next, looking a little bit further, there's a few different things that you can look at. Weaponization is one example, and I don't necessarily have a growth chart in here, but if we layer in things like Metasploit, where a vulnerability has been weaponized, or other types of exploit kits that threat actors are using. Um, this makes for about 2% of vulnerabilities with either known exploitation or have known to be weaponized of the 100% that we see here. So this really focuses on like, hey, there's a lot of vulns, where to focus efforts. The third thing I would say is growth rate of proof of concept code. From a data perspective, we calculate about 11.8% growth in POC exploits, meaning exploit, proof of concept exploit is available for a vulnerability, which certainly is, an indicator of risk, that could then be used or weaponized for exploitation purposes, from a threat actor perspective. So, few different angles to look there. What I think is interesting is if we take known exploitation. Oh, sorry. In regards to the 10 years that we looked at, about 31% of vulnerabilities are known to have a proof of concept. If we look at the known exploitation, that 1% or 1.1% that I looked at earlier, and I look at proof of concepts, about 72.9% of known exploited vulnerabilities have a proof of concept exploit. So proof of concept exploits definitely are an indicator, right? That there could be some aspect of risk associated with a vulnerability that then ends up being known to be exploited in the wild. So different ways you can think of, this vulnerability debt, aspect, as far as why people feel so inundated with all the different vulnerabilities coming at them is like, generally speaking, more vulnerabilities, more known exploitation, much more POC exploits, and more weaponization. And in addition to that, right, most organizations tend to have more assets. So those considerations are really what are coming at people in relation to vulnerability debt. If I hop over, and I'm going fast here because I want to be mindful of time. The other side of the factor is emerging threat. So I think of emerging threat as something where you need to act quickly, you need to take action. And I want to talk a little bit about where I see places are in regards to emerging threat that you should focus. So when I look at known exploited vulnerabilities, this is an example of a few years of new known exploited vulnerabilities. When I look at exploitation evidence, I looked at, hey, what is the time from a CVE becomes available to the time that it's known exploited? When I did this, I did take out, some of this bump in regards to things that are only identified as shadow servers, so that we're not using that aspect of bias of us adding as a source. But what I wanted to show essentially is, in 2023, if I look at the time from a CVE being disclosed to exploitation, there's a few significant things we can see. There was roughly, without the addition of shadow server that we had at VulnCheck, there was roughly 424 vulnerabilities, give or take. And I think I pulled this data set about a month or two ago. So sometimes there's some historical evidence that comes in later, so it might be a little bit more, but about 424 vulnerabilities known to be exploited that were disclosed during 2023. About 106 of them, if you look in this red, were 0 or less days. So from the time the CVE was actually disclosed. So that means you need to respond very quick and fast. Anything in orange is 1 to 90 days. And anything in yellow is 91 to 365 days, and purple 365 days. So there's some aspect of things you need to think about as it relates to emerging threat. And if I break this down, it just so happens that I came up with the same exact number, separate research, did not even talk to Yaniv about this, but about 25% of known exploited vulnerabilities, based on exploitation evidence being there on the day of disclosure or earlier, are 0 days. I'll use the term 0 day here. About 75% of known exploited vulnerabilities are what most people would call end days, or vulnerabilities that don't have evidence of exploitation until after the vulnerability has been disclosed. So I really think in some regards of separating these things out, to emerging threat and vulnerability debt. You might say that all known exploited vulnerabilities certainly you might want to treat as emerging threat, but I think this puts a framework together of how you think about how you prioritize your resources in an organization, where maybe 25% of your capacity does have to be focused on rapid response vulnerabilities. And I'll hop in a moment here and talk about the breakdown of some of the recommendations between the two. But before I do, I want to go in a little bit deeper. So if we look at 2023 zero-day vulnerabilities with exploitation evidence at the time of CVE disclosure, there's generally, a wide string of different technologies to consider. And I think as I get into ransomware, it's going to be more specific in grouping. But you should look at major technologies that you have within your environment. Things like Windows and making sure you have great patch management processes in place. Apple, Google, of course, usual suspects, Adobe products as well. There are some kind of funny ones here as well. So you see T-shirt e-commerce has 4. That's a dead WordPress plugin. So certainly you would want to uninstall that from your environment. But if I look at the total of 106, this is pretty close and aligned with Mandiant's recent zero-day report, which reported 97 zero days in 2023. So if I take maybe some of the like WordPress dead plugins out, we're coming to pretty much the same conclusion that there's roughly 100 things, right, that are coming up as 0 days that you have to respond very quick and rapidly to. And you'll see some common suspects on here: Cisco ASAs, Avanti, products, Barracuda Progress, as we go through VMware. And so these are areas where, really, really suggest and consider how you look at your patch management processes. And as Jason kind of mentioned, going around your business and understanding what software versions you're on for anything related to initial access and what devices you're using, and making sure you have very, very fast rapid response capabilities around those controls. Beyond the 0 days, I did want to hop into ransomware and vulnerabilities used with ransomware. So, as mentioned before, I think it's important to note a lot of people get hit with older vulnerabilities from a breach perspective by threat actors. Threat actors are always opportunistically going to look at the easiest things to pop. Microsoft environments are always target rich for that as well. So if we look at 2023 known exploited vulnerabilities associated with ransomware, I took a little bit different approach here and broke it down by different types of products and services. So we can see here operating system, top left, predominantly what we're talking about with operating systems and ransomware is Microsoft Windows. So definitely, if we look at ransomware in association, Windows being one of the top things to ensure you have patches applied and up to date. We also look at things like desktop applications. So looking at end of life software, commonly with ransomware attacks, we've seen, and maybe less nowadays, but Flash, Java, even Office as well. So making sure Office is up to date and any older end of life technology being pruned within your environment. Server infrastructure, so things on the internet like Atlassian. But certainly in the last year, we saw a lot in relation to file sharing, right? As the attackers shifted to data exfiltration. So definitely anything touching the internet. And then initial access devices or network edge devices. So think of your Citrix, Fortinet, SonicWall, Avanti, Palo Alto, Cisco ASAs F5. Like, we need to ensure and make sure that we're hardening these different products and services that are accessible on the edge. And hopping a little bit further, I did want to, just kind of get into some recommendations since we're almost at time. So, when we're looking at emerging threat and vulnerability debt, I really think about some of the considerations, as a practitioner that we need to take in mind. So, first time, if we look at, hey, 25% of our capacity has to be focused around emerging threat, that's going to be rapid response. We have to be ready for it at any time. We're typically talking about internet facing devices, which we saw a lot of 0 days and ransomware associated with. A lot of times it's end users interacting. And so it could also be not only things on the internet like a firewall, but it could be the end user devices themselves, right? So we think of a lot of like 0-day click type of vulnerabilities. And then certainly remotely exploitable factors are taken into consideration a lot of times from a threat actor perspective when we're looking at 0 days. And then on the vulnerability debt side, like the question always is like, how do I get ahead of this stuff? How do I actually remove large class of vulnerabilities within my environment? I think number one is having your assets and understanding what is the root cause behind all the vulnerabilities, right? Is it that you don't have patch management processes for certain asset types or certain devices? Um, I think it's really important to take that approach to see if you can remove large classes or volumes of vulnerabilities within your environment. Improving patch management is certainly a significant thing that can happen to help reduce vulnerabilities as well. Looking at what best practices you can implement and take in place. And then the last thing I always advise people is to consider like, hey, what unused EOL software do you have in your environment? And make plans to how you eradicate that from your environment as quickly as possible. Um, if I do look at evidence-based vulnerability prioritization, so this is very threat-centric, not talking so much on the asset side, but if I'm working top-down, the things I like to consider are, is it known to be exploited? Then factors of, is it ransomware, botnets, APTs, threat actors associated with it? Is there unattributed known exploitation, so we don't know the threat actor, for instance? Is the vulnerability weaponized? Is there exploit code? And then a long tail of all the other CVEs. So this is really how I'm starting to think and help others think about, like, from a threat-centric perspective, how do I start to look at prioritization of vulnerabilities? And then I think the other factors are certainly asset and exposure that you need to take into consideration. So last thing I'll leave you with, I did want to mention one of the things I think that is incredibly valuable, CISA Stop Ransomware Guide. There's a lot of great practices as far as hardening within your environment, specifically as it alludes to Microsoft Windows environments, which can be incredibly susceptible to ransomware. So some things to take into consideration, but I wanted to leave everybody today with at least some takeaways as far as things you could do actionable to make a considerable impact in relation to vulnerability management. I think that's it. I don't know if we have any questions.
Patrick, thank you. There are some questions in the chat. You can take another minute if you want to answer some of them. I think there's a question from Rob.
I always love, you may not have data in hand, but off the cuff, do you have thoughts on how perhaps TTPs may change based on age of CVE? Yeah, so age of CVE, a lot of people have older CVEs within their environments. In opportunistically, like, there's exploits available often, and exploits get used for a long period of time as it relates to exploitation. And so normally, what we're seeing and what others have confirmed as well is, vulnerability can go on being exploited for decades at times. And so, certainly have to take that into consideration. Just because something isn't old doesn't mean someone isn't going to opportunistically take advantage of it. And a lot of the exploit kits and tools, like, they don't take old CVs out. So certainly you'll continue to see those used as well.